spanning the globe from all points in the universe. You can search, but you won't find anyone except this particular space geek. Casual Space with Beth Munn.
My goodness, it is such a pleasure to have Marc back with his next and latest book. This time, we're talking about UFOs. Hi, Marc.
Hi, Beth. Good to be back.
I'm so glad to have you. This is such another fantastic book.
Thank you.
I love, in all your books, this is the case. You can open any page and enjoy it. I did the front to back. I did, but I also went back through and pulled a few highlights because you've got a lot of graphics, photos, images, historical records. This is fantastic collection. So congratulations. We are not alone. There it is, folks. Did you think we were? We're not. Did you have a bias going into writing this? How did you how did you accomplish this book? Were you like, let's just take it one by one, each case, and build a nice collection of, how this book isn't going to unfold? Or did you say, I'm here to debunk, or how did you go into starting this book?
So that's a good question. I don't think anyone's really asked me that before, but I did not go into it with a bias. I really just find the material fascinating, one way or the other. So to me, if there's evidence that shows aliens could be here, I find those stories, obviously those are fascinating stories, right? But if there's evidence that shows that can debunk a story, I find that fascinating too. One, because here's a story that people, claim to have witnessed or whatever it might be, and how it was reported, and all these things, those things happen, right? Those reports, those beliefs, those feelings, those, fears, hopes, whatever it might be. And then how that might be debunked can be equally fascinating. So I really like all of this, all these different kinds of stories. And it really, I think that one thing that's different about We Are Not Alone is that it does kind of walk the middle and just presents cases for both sides as they were, not again trying to do one or the other necessarily, just revealing the cases as they kind of unfolded. And most books on the topic that I've noticed are either very much for or very much against. So they're either really trying hard to debunk or really trying hard to prove, and then they kind of seem angry at the other side. You know what I mean? It becomes a bit of a turnoff as you're reading. Like, I just want to know the information, stories, facts as they are available to us, or those kinds of things. So that's kind of how I approach it. And I did take it a little bit like story by story as I'm going. And then obviously broken into different chapters on different kinds of sections, kind of broken out through the history of the whole topic.
I thought so too. Exactly. When I was reading it, I'm like, I'm still not sure where Marc stands. I'm going to have to ask him front and center, and we'll get to that. But you did a wonderful job of, well, not only leaving me saying, "Ooh, that could be either way," but really unfolding the history as it was presented. So let's get right into it. I've got questions about ancient alien architecture, which you cover, Martians sending messages to Tesla, the Drake equation, SETI, Pascal Lee's explanations on the Fermi paradox, the alien encounters, the first, second, and third. You mentioned even a fourth. Where should we start? It's all in this wonderful book and collected. And it's all laid out in a kind of chronological order, like kind of the history of sightings and how we discovered terms like UFOs and flying saucers. Where should we start?
Well, we could start with the flying saucer term, because that is kind of what marks the start of the modern UFO phenomena. And that was in June of 1947, when a pilot from Boise, Idaho, named Kenneth Arnold was flying over Washington, and he saw these shining discs kind of off in the distance flying by, whizzing quickly. And this was very unusual. Obviously, he didn't know what these were. He really didn't know. He just reported what he saw when he landed. Word quickly traveled to the media. He described them as like skipping like saucers. And a reporter then coined the term flying saucer based on that comment. And so that, as I said in the book, has forever changed our skies and our lexicon. So that was the beginning of the flying saucers. And immediately following Kenneth Arnold's sighting, it was June 24th, within days, there were reports all across the country. Almost every state within like a week or two had reported sightings of UFOs. Many of them were quickly shown to be hoaxes, but many just sort of still mysterious. What were people seeing? Were they the same things? Again, no one knew. Lots of people were chiming in with different theories of what they could be, from professors and meteorologists. I'll running the gamut of different people with their theories. And again, Kenneth Arnold, he just said, "Hey, I just saw some weird things in the sky. I don't know what they are." Weeks after that, again, that was June 24th. Within the first week of July, you have the Roswell incident, which is obviously a pretty big one in the UFO world and now in pop culture. I mean, you've had TV shows based on it and movies and all these kinds of things. And what's so amazing about that case is that's when the government, the army actually claimed it had recovered a flying disc. Like that was the headline in the Roswell Daily News, which is really unbelievable
Yes, I'm going
that
to
they
stop
printed
you
that.
right there because there's a photo of said found alien in your book. It's disgusting.
Oh,
Ew.
the alien.
Yes. In 1947 at the International UFO Museum. Did you actually see this, or is this just a photo pulled from the archives?
No, that's my photo. And
Oh,
that's just part of the museum
goodness.
exhibit.
You saw this.
Yeah, and it's just, that's just the whatever they made up for their exhibit.
Okay. It's
Yeah.
not claimed to be, it's just like, but
Yes.
is
Representative.
it, but okay, but it's based on what accounts were, and it's still like, I'm looking at this and I'm like, did Mark really see this? Where did he find this photo? What is this? Because it's just creepy. It's creepy.
Yeah. Well, what happened was it's really Roswell's such a fascinating story because the next day they retracted the statement about the flying disc being recovered and said it was a weather balloon. And then the story really kind of disappeared. There's maybe another mention of it for another day or two, I'd say, within the media. And then there's really no mention of Roswell again in old newspapers or even books at that era. There's like one mention in, I think, like a paragraph in the 60s with, I think, a Frank Edwards book. But for the most part, Roswell disappears until 30 years later in the late 70s. And it gets brought back up again with a ufologist and a nuclear scientist named Stanton Friedman, who kind of gets wind of this story and starts interviewing people in the Roswell area who remember excuse me, who remember things from back then.
Huh?
And then you start to wonder, then of course the question is how accurate are these memories? Is everyone telling the truth? But he did uncover a lot of interesting stories and met with people who were with the army recovering the pieces that did fall. Something did fall and crash. Of course, the debate is whether that was a UFO or was that actually a weather balloon, as the government claimed. Years later, the government expanded on that and said it was a secret project called Project Mogul, which was a different kind of high altitude weather balloon that was designed to spy over Moscow and check out their nuclear programs. And so that's why it was so secretive. So what I love about that is their secret was so secretive that they decided to cover that up with a UFO story. And then they had to cover up the UFO story when they thought maybe that cover up was a bad idea. So, and then it
Right?
just creates all this kind of controversy and conspiracy theory stuff, from there.
Sure. Which just when you think like such nonsense, then what just happened 2 summers ago when we actually had a balloon spying on, from, was it
Yeah.
China? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was, last February of 2023,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
So just a little, it's like, okay, well, there's a case study that's right here in reality. So I
And
love this that we're seeing things cycle through, like years, all those years go by and everyone's like, okay, Roswell, maybe, and then it resurfaces. And here we are, 2023, and there's an actual balloon here.
and that within that week, there were three other unidentified flying objects, as the media was actually referring to them as, they were shot down and they were never recovered. And so while they
That we know
identified
of.
the spy balloon from China, the other three were not identified and were
Crazy.
very different than the spy balloon.
Crazy.
So we still know what those are, but they were flying
Crazy.
in American and Canadian airspace and no one knew what they were, which is pretty weird.
Lots of things are weird and lots of things get explained in your book. You told me before the book, before we're sitting down today, a while back about a friend's theory that shared what he thought the Roswell incident was. Can you share that with us? Because I found it fascinating and somewhat rational.
I love this one. This is from Dr. Pascal Lee,
Yeah.
planetary scientist. And so I had reached out to him. I met him when I wrote the Big Book of Mars. And I reached out to him for this book just to kind of get his sense of, what he thought about the topic, especially in the wake of the recent news with, the Tic Tac sightings and the different revelations from the government, Navy pilots, what they were seeing and what his take was on those sightings. And again, like I said, the topic at large. So he was great. He gave me a lot of really interesting perspectives on it, and that's covered in the book. But then he said, "Hey, I have a theory on Roswell," and it was fun because he's a scientist, and scientists they write peer-reviewed papers, and that requires data and evidence, all these things. So he can't just write a theory on Roswell. He's not going to get any kind of
Yeah.
peer review on that. But he's like, "But I can share it with you, and then you're welcome to share it in your book." So I was happy to do that. But basically, what he said was he found different ways to explain everything with through terrestrial means. So if it was a high altitude weather balloon, that would make sense, right? That we would be spying on Moscow, and that would be new materials. Even like the mylar that was used would be new material. So when that fell to the ground and crashed, and people found it, that sort of metallic foil-like substance would be different. This wouldn't be something that people were used to. So right there is a small piece of evidence that people thought was extraterrestrial, but like, well, it's just top secret material that you haven't been, privy to yet. So
Sure.
that's one thing.
Yeah.
But if they were testing, if they were having these high altitude balloons to go over Moscow, they didn't have like camera equipment that they could just take photos with remotely at that time. So he thought, well, maybe what they were doing was they were training monkeys to send up into the high altitude balloons, and they could be trained to push a button, to click a button to take a photo. Maybe they get a little banana chip as a reward. And this was the kind of techniques used at that time to work with animals and behaviorism. They also would have wanted to test biological responses to the high altitude to see like what is it like, can it survive? So to do that, they would put a lot of, I guess, electrodes on it, or whatever, to measure its biometrics, things like that. So to do that, you would shave the monkey to
Mhm.
put that over its skin. So imagine you have now a shaved monkey in this high altitude craft, and that would be a small gray figure with a large head and long limbs,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Which matches the description of what people said they saw. Again, 30 years later, they said they saw these kind of small child-sized beings with large heads and long limbs that were then taken, brushed away. So it
Yeah.
kind of lines up with what people were
It
describing later.
kind of does.
So
Very
you shave
much
a
so.
monkey, put it in this high altitude balloon, it crashes sadly, right? And then they have to clean it up and cover up this whole story. And then again, because of what they were doing to animals, they probably didn't want that getting out because it's horrific. And I did find, so again, this was July of 47,
Yeah.
and I did find evidence of um, monkeys being sent into space as early as I think early 48 in the New Mexico area. And that was, in, files accessible to me. So not that big of a stretch to think that was happening just a few months earlier too, and just
Yeah.
not, out there for the public to know about. So I do love how that accounts for everything that people said that they witnessed, but again, has a terrestrial explanation for it.
I like this idea. Yeah. When you shared it with me, I was following right along and I thought, not actually implausible. If I ever shaved my dog, people would be like, alien encounter attack. She's such a fuzzy, full sheepdog. I can't even imagine her without her hair. And when she's wet, it's quite a hilarious creature thing look, that
Yeah.
it's like if she were coming down the street at me, I'd be like, what in the world is that thing?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then, of course, she loves everyone. So she would be jumping right on you and towards you. It could be horrific. No, but it's true. The things we think we see, and to ask someone to recollect years and years ago, I don't even remember. My kids tell me all the time, remember when we did this and you said that and I did that and we were all scared. And I'm like, no. And it was like 5 years ago, Mark. I can't even remember that. And that's funny too, because perfect example, their interpretation from the back seat of the car was very different than mine as the driver. And they'll tell me things like, remember when we were driving and I saw this thing and you said that and it was actually this? No, of course not. I was driving, I was focused. But a kid in the back seat, that's their whole world. And they see something very differently and their perspective's very different. So I can only imagine. And I know through the years, this is obviously what, Project Blue Book and other parts of your book examine how people have these interpretations. Mark, you have so much here in the book, but there's a new show on History Channel where they sit down with an actual, like a scientist and a ufologist. Have you seen this show? I can't remember the name of it, but it's the public, it's persons who present their case. They say, here's my evidence, or here's my photo, or here's my narrative. And the whole goal of the show is to one by one walk through, is this a real UFO sighting or can this be explained? So I'm telling you
Hmm.
this because recently I'm sitting there watching this on the couch with Chad, and this couple comes in and they live out in Arizona, and they had this sighting where these blips were moving across the sky, and they were coming across the sky in a train like um, pattern, and they were kind of bright, and then they would disappear and then they'd reappear and it would move across the sky, and they were convinced that this was a UFO sighting. So the persons that are the hosts walk through was their airlines, airplanes in the pattern on that day and time, what other military things perhaps were on the manifest that day and time flying, and what else was going on. So it turns out, I don't know if you have yet to see a Starlink group of satellites go overhead. Have you seen this yet in real
No.
life? Okay. So I'm sitting there with Chad and I'm like, I wonder if it's Starlink. Can we just mention this? And we're talking and we're watching the show. And then I say, wait a minute, push pause. Whoa, hold on. Turns out in early May, when the couple saw the sighting, it was also our annual Analog Astronaut Conference in May in Arizona, out in the desert near the biosphere where we were for the Analog Astronaut Conference. And this was 2023, May, Arizona. And I said, Chad, this if they saw the Starlink, that's the same Starlink launch orbit that we saw at the Analog Astronaut Conference, where all 200 of us came running out of the conference and we were like, whoa. Now we knew because we're in the industry, we're like, that's the Starlink, but it was still unspeakably eerie. They seem so close. They are so bright on the horizon that you could it's like a low airplane, and you're seeing trails of them, like many of them in a line orbiting all together. So there they were. I'm excited because now I'm seeing the same thing this couple is saying they saw in Arizona, same date, same time. I'm like, they're seeing the Starlink. So on the show, they're presented that fact. The host walks them through what is Starlink, what they're seeing, and what it was. And they walked away on the show saying, nope, we decline this. And we are convinced it was not that, it was a UFO sighting. And I'm sitting there, I'm screaming at the TV. I'm like, it was Starlink. I saw it too. I was there.
Wow.
And they, as a couple, say, no, no, we recognize your presented evidence, and yet we choose to not believe that that is what we saw. And Chad and I are just dumbfounded. We're looking at each other and we're like, but they were presented the evidence, but I was there too. And I'm telling you, that's the Starlink. So here we are, Mark. And it's like, I was beside myself. I'm like, I know this is a TV show, but I just wanted to like talk to this couple further and be like, so what? Wow. Right? Wow.
I want to see this show. I haven't heard this one, but it's a really interesting concept.
I'll put it in the show
And
notes.
I'd be
Everyone can see this episode. I'll find it. I'll put it in the
yeah.
show notes. but it's a perfect example of, like, again, your book is so well presented that you leave us with enough information as you go through each chapter, each case study, each encounter. And it leaves me going, so what was it? What could it have been?
Yeah, and there's a few really odd ones that are just still unexplained.
Let's talk about those. Which stood out to you that you're like, if it sat with you this long that you want to
There's
walk us through?
there's a couple, and they both involve triangular UFOs.
Oh,
So one of them was a friend of mine who was a huge help with this book, actually. His name was Lee Spiegel, and he was a journalist who'd been studying UFOs since the 70s. Sadly, he passed away just before this was published. So
oh
that
no.
was really horrible.
Oh,
But Lee had this amazing experience, which I wrote about in Lumberton, North Carolina in the mid 70s. And he was sent there by J. Allen Hynek, who was the director for Project Blue Book on the scientific side. And basically people were reporting seeing this triangular UFO flying overhead. So he went down, he met with the sheriff, the local sheriff, and they go out driving, following the reports. They're not seeing anything for a while. Finally, they see this thing, and they pull up the side of the road, and this triangular UFO about treetop level high is just hovering there with the lights perfectly silently.
creepy.
And it's like it beams a light. Lee said it beamed the light like at his feet. And then it just took off, and they started to chase it, and they couldn't keep up with it. Another police officer later reports seeing it blinking his lights and like playing like a game of Simon, like he blinks twice, the UFO blinks twice,
No.
it took off. And then Lee, he's a reporter, so he's like investigating, okay, well, what did we just see? He's checking in with all the local Air Force bases where you're doing tests, where there are pilots going by, new aircraft, nothing aligned at all with the time and what he saw, what he witnessed with the police officer and others as well. There was, I think, a small crowd there. So he wrote up everything he saw, again, did all the homework about anything that might be going on in the region. And no one ever had an explanation for this. And he told me how he would go to people who were debunkers and he'd say, this is what I saw. Here's everything I can tell you. So what do you think it was? And I think he told me one guy at some point said, like, well, maybe it was like an electric kite. And he's like, I don't think that was a kite. Think I know the difference. So that's one. And then along those lines, about 20 years later was the Phoenix Lights, which is another huge, massively huge triangular UFO going over the Phoenix area and more than just Phoenix, over Arizona.
Lots happening
About
in Arizona.
about 20,000 people witnessed this thing. And it's
Oh,
after I wrote the book, someone, a former coworker of mine, reached out to me saying that she was there and she saw it. Again, it's
see?
different when it's people you actually know telling you
Yeah,
these things.
it does
'Cause
change. Yeah,
obviously it'd be ideal to have your own personal experience, but at least it's people that you know, and it's not just anyone. And do you believe them or not?
yeah.
Um, but again, 20,000 people see this thing, including the governor of Arizona, who later came out. First, he kind of mocked it, and that's covered in the book. But years later, he came out acknowledging that he went to see this thing, had no idea what it was, and it seemed extraterrestrial to him. And basically, this, again, triangular object, people could see it was physical, silently going by slowly. And the government later said, the Air Force nearby said it was doing a flares test and dropping flares, but everyone who saw it said this was not flares. We understand what flares look like and that they fall. This was moving steadily across the sky. And sounds a little bit like your couple, but they were adamant that like these were not
Yeah.
flares. I think there's a bigger visual difference between.
20,000 people. Come
Yeah,
on.
so how do you explain these mass types of sightings? Now there was a one instance I mentioned in the book that was I'm forgetting right now the name of the company, but it was some kind of aerospace company, private, not like NASA. And they had been working on a triangular type of a balloon type of craft, high altitude triangular balloon type thing. So it would move slowly and silently, but he said it wasn't theirs. And unless someone had stolen their technology and was testing it, he had no idea. But he said, we do have something similar to that, what was described, but it wasn't ours. And he also said, we don't know why that would be tested over a populated area anyway. And if so, like, why not just come out and say it? Like, why the secrecy if that was the case?
Yeah.
So that to me is one of those weird ones. It's like, okay, well, what was this thing? Was it a very highly secretive government project that just remains secret today? Maybe we'll find out years later. Who knows?
Yeah.
Was it something more? Was it, extraterrestrial? We don't know. But it's a fascinating one that, again, you have thousands of witnesses that saw the same thing and swear by what they saw, and there's just still no explanation for it. So again, it keeps
Yeah.
you wondering.
Um, you have some when it comes to adults, us, we are hardened. We are skeptical. We are life livers that we've seen stuff. We know how the sunset and things on the horizon and all these dusk, like things that can play tricks on us and what we see and what we experience and what we think is there and then it's not. Anyone who's ever been hunting and has sat in a deer blind, me included, who like you're like, was that it? And then you're like, I swear that is a creature or a thing or a deer or a something. And then as the sun slowly comes up, you're like, that was a tree stump the whole time. Right? It's just right. We're adults. And so we get this sense of um probably not probably something provable or tangible or what have you. But kids are very different. And you open up the book with a story, a couple of stories actually, that are so, oh, they just stuck me straight through. They went straight to my soul because I'm like, holy cow, like people who have had these encounters and they're kids. So, and I know kids exaggerate and sometimes, we fib and do their things, but not for reasons that would be of their safety or harm. And some of these kids were harmed. And I read that, and it really set the tone for the book to be like, okay, look, how do you explain this? We can go all day round and round and say, well, we're adults and things can happen, and there's always government, and there's always these things. But these children, what chose you to like, did these were powerful stories. What a way to open the book. When you read these, what were you feeling? How did you experience these stories?
Well, the one it's in the introduction to the book, I met this man. This particular man had an experience in 1964. He was 8 years old, and I didn't know that this is not a story that's really written about anywhere, at least contemporary. I mean, there's old newspaper documents or newspaper articles documenting his case, so it's it's documented, right? It's not like just a
Mhm.
memory from him. Um, but I had traveled to just outside of Albuquerque early on in my research for the book to visit a guy who I met through Lee Spiegel, the man I mentioned before. His name is David Marler. He runs what's now called the National Historical UFO Record Center. And he just has this massive, massive collection of UFO files. He's got all the Project Blue Book files, like the original project cards, the original files in file cabinets lining this room off the side of his house. Um, and all kinds of media, tons of books, reel to reel. I mean, anything, like anything on UFOs, he's got it. And he's just amassed collections from various groups. So as I was going through, where do I even begin with all this stuff?
Yeah.
He was helpful, really helpful guiding me. But he said I was planning to go to Roswell in a couple of days to do research there as well, which is where I took that photo you mentioned, of course. And he said, oh, there's a guy I did some research on who lives in Roswell now, and he had this UFO experience. Let me text him and see if he'll meet with you. So he did. So I had lunch with him and his wife and shared more of his story with me. But basically, when he was 8 years old, as I mentioned, this was in Hobbs, New Mexico, so outside of Roswell, and he's playing in the back parking lot of his grandmother's laundromat, and there's really no one there, and he sees this thing like across the street, again about like treetop level, about 3 stories high. He as he remembered, and it was top shaped, which is not a typical UFO shape at the time. Everyone described them as saucer-like, that flying saucers. No one talked about tops in the sky, like a spinning
Hmm.
top. And it was black. And he said it just started kind of mimicking his movements. So if he like went, to the right, it would go to the right. He'd go over to the left, it would go over to the left. He'd go back and forth with them. He's like, what is this thing? And he saw all of a sudden it darts right over toward him, right above his head, and belches out flames and burned his head from the chin up. And his grandmother just stepped out at the back at the time and saw this. And so she, got the flames out right away and took him to the emergency room. And fortunately, there was a burn specialist there who cared for him right away. And, the police investigated, the FBI investigated. They saw nothing at the site that left any evidence, any kind of evidence of what could have caused this. So, like, nothing on the ground below that would give them a clue, nothing from the machinery, something from like a dryer spitting out at the rear that could have caused this. Like, none of that added up to what happened to this young boy. And again, this was covered in newspapers about the burning and everything.
Yeah.
He recovered. As I saw him, he looked fine.
Mhm.
But again, this was probably, I don't know, what was this, 50 years, 60 years later? So,
Yeah. Yeah.
he had time obviously to recover, but he was fine. And he said that he never said, "Oh, I had a UFO sighting." He just said this weird thing happened to me, and he kind of put it on the back shelf of his mind and just kind of moved on with his life. He wasn't looking to capitalize on it, make money, none of that kind of thing. It just was a strange thing that happened to him, and he really didn't talk about it. He talked about once with an investigator in the late 60s who called, who was a physicist who was looking into this, and that was kind of it. And then it just went away until David Marler found this story and interviewed him, and then I interviewed him. And really, that's all he's talked about this. So a really bizarre case with a guy who's not out looking to make a buck from it, but this is what happened to him. And the weird thing is these sort of top-shaped UFOs started appearing elsewhere, and as the summer continued, elsewhere in the country, and also burned people, which was really weird. And then people
Yeah.
started looking out for them, and
Oh
then it went away,
gosh.
and that was it.
Yeah.
Again, no explanation. Like, was this a weird government project, some kind of craft being tested? And if so, why would it go belching fire over children? So
Yes.
what
And
what
if
was
you're
this
like
thing?
my son, he couldn't lie until like recently. He's a teenager now and he still doesn't lie, but he'll be like hesitant. But I mean, this kid was truth no matter what. He'll say like, if you ask him like, anything about, and, did the dog, you know, poop on the rug? He'll be like, yes. Or did you eat the chocolate? Yes. I mean, the kid just couldn't, that was, 8, 9, 10. Most kids are like that. So I can't imagine having that experience. Was he, when you were speaking with him, it sounds like he's just chalking this up to like this thing happened and I lived life.
Yeah.
Did he seem like I would have a million questions for him. Like now, was it validating to know that other people had this experience and you weren't alone on this? Or was it spiritual for him, or was he scared or frightened? And how did he go through and move through life after this without validation? Did his grandma console him? And what did she say about it? I mean, I would have a million questions.
Yeah. And they're all good questions. He shared the details, but didn't want to talk too much more. Like, I think it was not something he was really comfortable talking
Yeah.
about,
Yeah. As are
overall.
most, right? If it's an
Yeah.
unknown, that's the whole thing, unknown. Um, and you can't explain it. How do you explain it? And your
Yeah.
walkthrough through this book gives a little bit of explanation to things through their recollections, through things that were records that you present so well. You walked through historical things we've already touched upon a little bit, like you mentioned J. Allen Hynek, some of the physicists that have looked into this, and bringing it into modern times with movies and music and the pop culture of all this. Do you think that we are a little more open to this, and therefore, the government is a little more, we'll release documents, we'll have more conversations about this. NASA's recognized this because through the years, this has not gone away. Everyone seems to have a more comfortable sense of bringing it forward.
Yeah. It's really interesting how it's developed over the decades. So first of all, I think it's great that the government is finally talking about this and acknowledging that there are things in the airspace that are unidentified. So now they call unidentified aerial phenomena UAP to sort of
Mhm.
disassociate with the stigma of UFO. I'm going to come back to that in a second.
Okay, good.
But but that becomes, and I talked about this, it's at the end of the book, the last chapter. This was when everything came out in the New York Times in 2017 about the UFO studies that the government was still doing very secretively, and these, the Tic Tac video that the Navy pilots saw in 2004, and all this stuff, was made a bigger issue because it was a matter of national defense as opposed to our aliens coming. Because there are things that pilots are seeing that we don't know what they are, right? So
Yeah,
that's
that's
not good.
important.
Our government's not, we're supposed to be protecting us. And if things are flying overhead and we don't know what they are, either a foreign adversary has surpassed us in some technology, which is not good, and we need to find out what that is and catch up, right? Or surpass them, or it's something else, potentially extraterrestrial. And that's also something to be curious about and potentially concerned about. Personally, I think if it's extraterrestrial, seems like we're okay because we're still here.
Yeah.
Seems like if they could get here and they wanted to do something, they could have by now. But what I want to jump back to with the UFO stigma is, I think all those early stories from the 40s and 50s, and in the 50s, we haven't talked about this yet, but there was this whole group of people called contactees who claimed to be talking to people from outer space, the space people, like typically Venusians, which is interesting. Not so much Martians. Venusians were very popular back then.
Who happen to be beautiful women.
Yes, they were always beautiful, beautiful men and women, and always like, oh, the most beautiful person, and they had blonde hair. They're always described as being Scandinavian, like was kind of common too. But there were a lot of and there were a lot of books on these, and they're kind of fun, quirky stories.
Mhm.
But these people were very vocal, lecturing and having festivals and almost like mini cult leaders in some ways. But they were kind of doing it to preach a peaceful message because this was coming off of the atomic age after World War II. So it was basically saying that space people are coming here to warn us that the atomic age was very dangerous and we could destroy ourselves and potentially affect the rest of the solar system. We don't want to mess up Venus and Mars and even Saturn. There's lots of Saturnians that were talked about as well. So they were coming to warn us. So again, the idea of a peaceful message in the atomic age is a good one, but I think that just added to the stigma of flying saucers and space people and all this kind of thing. So that turns scientists away from the topic, and it doesn't get studied seriously. And so only more recently, as the government has acknowledged this as something to investigate and figure out what it is, and now scientists, I think the stigma is moving away. You have new terminology, UAP. So they're more open to studying it. And so now we can maybe learn something more, and maybe we learn something more about physics that we didn't know before. And there have been cases like that explain different sightings that pilots had. Sprites and elves, lightning shooting up from clouds wasn't known about before. And pilots reported out all the time, like, I just saw this thing above the, didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
And you learned about that once we had the technology to discover those things. So maybe there'll be more of that. We don't know. But I talked to Avi Loeb, the head of astronomy at Harvard, who was the
Yeah.
one who believes that Oumuamua, the first interstellar object that went through space in 2017, or through our solar system, I should say, and thought that could be an alien artifact, some kind of ancient architecture floating through our solar system. And he gives all his reasons why. Basically, the characteristics that we have of it don't align with any other characteristics of rocks or comets or anything like that. So maybe it's something else, therefore. But now he's got, from the success of his book about that, he's got funding, and he's got 100 scientists working with him on the Galileo project. And so now you have real scientific weight and, credentials, funding, equipment, all being put towards this topic. And so he wants to collect his own data. He's not going to wait for the government to give it data. It's like the
Yeah.
solar system isn't, no one owns it, so we can collect our own data.
Yeah.
And maybe we can finally learn something more about the science, physics, the scientific world around us, or is it something from beyond coming here to visit us, which is exciting. And it makes me wonder, what if that effort and that intelligence and that funding was put towards this topic, 50, 60, 70 years ago? What might we know already? What have we kind of lost because we've sort of shoved it aside and maybe mocked it,
Good
so
point. Yeah. Speaking of
it's exciting to
government,
see.
it is exciting. Speaking of government, you showcased for us in the book the presidents who have had some sightings, including Carter, Reagan, and another Democratic nominee. So they don't deny it. And
Yeah.
that's quite the thing. So this stigma you talk about, I mean, to have that recognized openly, publicly from world leaders, that's quite something.
Yeah. Again, it's like, okay, well, what's going on? And so when you hear from people like that, again, people tend to think of flying saucers as people, back country on their back porch looking up and don't know what they're seeing. And of course, there's that, but there's a lot of very highly respected people who see things as well. Again, like
Yeah.
these Navy pilots, people trusted to fly these, billion-dollar aircraft, know what they're doing, know what's in the skies. You want to believe that if they see something that's unidentified in defined physics, that maybe there is something unidentified that's defined physics.
Sure. Yeah,
What
I
is it?
think I've always had this theory that we have been through the years slowly getting more and more and more disconnected. Well, obviously we've been disconnected through the Industrial Revolution. We've just had to grind it, right? We've had to work to survive. And work to survive does not mean what it once meant as humans to look up at the sky, navigate by the stars, look at the stars and the skies for harvesting and planting and get, the times to travel and the times to sit still and the storms that would come and cycle through. That's just not what we're in touch with anymore. Um, so we so rarely look into the night sky, and with pollution being what it is, it's very difficult for a lot of people to not only not just see the night sky, but definitely even a step further to feel connected to it. So I've had this theory that we're so disconnected that even if there was something that's totally explainable in the night sky, who are we to recognize it anymore? We don't look up often enough. We're not familiar with things that fly over us and apparatus and types of aircraft. So there's that. But there's a whole new, as you say, there's a whole new um, recognition of not only are we not in touch with our stars and our place in the world in the sky above us, but we are discovering more and more things and being more in tune with technology than ever before. So it's giving us the opportunity to look more and understand more in depth. And yet, I'm going to push back on this whole little theory. I love what Neil deGrasse Tyson says in his clever, he does these one offs, these clever texts and things where he's like, well, if there's, things that we haven't seen yet or aliens with everyone on this planet that has a cell phone, why haven't we caught it on camera? How come no one has captured this? And I get that too. It's kind of like we're so connected that we can't capture a phenomena if it's happening, which is funny and ironic. But I do appreciate that as you walk through this book, you've given us so many references. I want to get into SETI, and I really want to walk through, if you don't mind, because you had such a privilege in working with Pascal Lee. He has a whole page that you put together on his 14 possible explanations to the Fermi paradox, and you're laughing, you're smiling, and you've
Yeah,
broken
they're
it
great.
down explanation and interpretation. So let's read a few here. And this is, oh my goodness, my glasses here. I'll let you do it. Why don't you pick a few out that you loved?
Uh,
Um,
which page is that? I gotta jump to it.
at 231, 231. I love this.
So this
Um,
was just to preface. This was I pulled this with Pascal's permission, of course, from
it's
his
fantastic.
lecture, which he has on YouTube called N equals approximately one alone in the Milky Way, and being a reference to the number of uh, extraterrestrial civilizations based on the Drake equation. So this is sort of this lecture is kind of his interpretation of the Drake equation, which we can jump back to as well. But again, that was that was from Frank Drake in the 1961, trying to understand how many extraterrestrial civilizations might there be in the galaxy, along
Yeah.
with a bunch of scientists working with him. So as he went through, um, he has these explanations for why the Fermi paradox, why haven't we found them yet? Where are they?
Hmm.
Where is everybody?
Hmm.
If there's so many options out there,
Where are
where are
they?
they hiding? So let's see. He has one: interstellar communications and travel are too difficult. interpretations were not worth pursuing. Intelligent civilizations are too alien, and the interpretation is lost in translation. Uh, Intelligent civilizations are too advanced or too busy. Interpretation, we mean nothing. We mean nothing to them. They've got other fish to fry.
Right?
Which again,
I
it's
love
like,
this.
who knows? Maybe, it's like, what if we are the ants to this other extraterrestrial civilization? Like, we don't care what the ants are doing here.
Right?
Not paying attention to
Right?
them. So there's a lot that he's got, a
I
good
love
list of
that.
there.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite parts of the book because it puts into perspective like, okay, look, if you think it's just us in the universe, okay, but if you think there's other intelligent life out there, here's some reasons why we may not be of interest to them, or this might not be the priority for them as well. And then there's the whole concept of time. It's like
Yes,
maybe someone already reached out to us and we weren't evolved enough yet to
I
respond,
agree.
or maybe we've done that with our Viking and the things and the messages we've sent out into the universe, and it hasn't landed yet, or just hasn't received the message yet.
Yeah, I think the time factor is really interesting. So I think the thing that's often thrown out there is the number of planets out there, right? The number of stars, the number of planets. We're finding more and more exoplanets. So like, the numbers, there's like 1 trillion planets in the galaxy alone. So surely there's something out there, right? But I think there's two interesting things on that. One is, like you said, the time factor. Like, well, is the timeline anywhere close to ours? I mean, we're like a blip in the 13 billion
Yeah.
years of the universe that we know of, right?
Yeah.
That we to believe to be the case. So how long did it take us to evolve to where we are? And are we actually in any kind of alignment for another civilization to receive and send messages that we can connect with each other? Maybe, but that's a huge gap, right? That's like
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
massive amount of time to align. And then one thing I thought was really interesting in Pascal Lee's explanation with his lecture is he talks about the fact that we are on the edge of the galaxy, which is a pretty safe area to be, but there's thousands and thousands of stars and planets which are in a bad area of the galaxy, which are vulnerable to gamma ray bursts, which could just destroy them, like that, like they're just gone. So maybe
Hmm.
you have intelligent life that's evolving, flourishing, whatever, but then it just gets wiped out. Like, how long
Yes.
can it last long enough to get to us, to receive things, to send things? So there's a lot of other interesting factors he talks about. And again, just about how unique we are too as a species to even be here, which, for example, like dinosaurs were here for hundreds of millions of years, right? But they didn't do much, they didn't really progress too much. And then they get hit by Earth gets hit by the asteroid, they die out. A few mammals
Exactly.
hide and survive and evolve into us. And so we're here. And then even talks about the fact that we are above water, so we can look up in the sky, but like dolphins have intelligence, but they can't look up at the sky and study anything because they exist beneath the water. So
Yeah.
there's all
Yeah.
these interesting factors about us that make us incredibly special and unique. And so
Agreed.
did all those variables align on another planet that's in the Goldilocks zone to host life? I mean, host intelligent life? There's so many interesting questions. And then later in the book I get into technosignatures and how we can start using James Webb and we'll be able to use its successor to start to explore the idea of technosignatures on planets, which would be indicative of intelligent life on
Yeah.
exoplanets, which
Yeah.
I
I
find
love
so
that.
fascinating
Hmm.
that we can start to actually get scientific answers that it looks like something's there. And one of the scientists I interviewed from NASA talked about, even when we have that data, we might find that there is some sort of technology on a planet. So proof that there's some intelligent life that put it there. But that doesn't mean that there's anyone there because it's analogous to what we have on Mars right now. Like, if someone found another civilization found technology on Mars, they'd find no one there.
Yeah.
They'd have to
Yeah.
find us over here, So it's just fascinating questions just keep coming up, as we
So
go on.
the book's never done.
No, it's definitely never done. Exactly. That was actually one thing as I was writing the final chapter, I'm like, oh my God, things are going to keep unfolding as I'm in edits and as the book is being printed. And
Right? but that's the fun of it all.
Yeah.
And the reason why SETI exists and so many people and scientists are looking more and more and deeper and further into space and time is to ultimately ask that question, are we alone in the universe? And Mark, we are not alone. This book is fantastic. And,
Thank you.
I love that it's anecdotal and researched, and there's so much to unpack in this that I think anyone who's enjoying a fun read or a more scientific read, all of which can find their place and have an enjoying readable experience here. But what was it for you when you were done with this? And we're talking about it now. I mean, you've put it to bed and it's resurfaced. Here we are. You seem to have a theme, Mark. You're looking at Mars with a pop culture perspective. You're looking at the UFO culture and you're keeping your unbiased. You've talked about in your writings before ghosts and critters and creatures. And what is this interest that you keep looking around the corners and under rocks?
I mean, for me, I love all these kinds of unknown stories and the possibilities. I love, what could be and what we could learn. So I just find those things I've always found those things fascinating. What's around us? What do we still have to learn? Could something be visiting us? And it was such an interesting book to be working on because I always had, like the angel and devil on the shoulders kind of thing, telling you different things
Sure.
about theirs. Not to say angel and devil, but I always felt like I had like the experiencers on one shoulder, people I talked to who had experiences, which could be very convincing, like what their experience was and what they believed. And then I had like the scientist on the other shoulder reminding me like science takes time, people rush into answers. And if you don't have an answer, we form one ourselves. But it takes time for science to figure things out and try to balance those two to kind of guide me a little bit. And
Yeah.
then that's kind of left me a little bit in this sort of middle position. Like I would say I'm very open to the idea that there's something here and that there's something out there.
Mm.
It seems very possible that something is out there, of course. Again, there's the time thing we discussed, there's the gamma ray explosions, that we discussed,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there still seems like there could be something out there, of course. Um, and I just really hope that we are close to actually finding some real evidence that's, indisputable. And it's
Yeah.
funny, you talked about technology and the Neil deGrasse Tyson line
Huh?
about phones. And one thing I find interesting is that the more our technology progresses, the more we're able to learn, right, and discover. But it also means that if someone did get those videos that he was talking about, would anyone even believe them? Because now we have so much technology that you could fake these things so easily and so beautifully. I mean, AI can just doctor whatever you want and make it look really legitimate. So I feel like we'll
Right.
get the evidence and people still won't believe it. Or at least a population won't believe it unless I think you see it with your own eyes in front of you.
I
It'll be
think you're
hard.
right.
That's what makes the past cases so interesting, is because you didn't have that technology at the time. So a lot of those really early cases, the evidence is really intriguing. Of course, then you don't have the firsthand accounts you can still get because those people are gone. So, again, it's kind of tough to be able to study, but a lot of those early cases where things were defying physics are really intriguing because they were happening then, not like 20 years ago when maybe China could have been doing something like a Tic Tac
Right.
thing, but
Right.
not in the 50s.
Yeah.
So it all leaves the mystery open, which again
It
keeps things
does.
entertaining and
It
intriguing for all
sure
of us.
does. So I have to ask, have you ever seen a UFO or UAP?
I haven't. I have not. And the only thing I saw that was weird to me was interestingly enough was when I went to New Mexico, of course in New Mexico.
Of
And
course.
you talked about like the pollution in the skies, and we don't get to look up very often. But I was on the outskirts of Albuquerque, and so it was like a very clear sky. And so I got into my place like 10 at night, and this was like just a small like Airbnb place, so not like a hotel. It was dark. So I told myself I'm gonna look up at the sky. I just want to stare at the stars and kind of appreciate it. And it's a view I'm not going to get in New York.
Uh-huh. Right,
So I
right.
do that, and I'm seeing all the stars, and I just see something moving like zipping around like a mosquito might or something, or like a moth,
Okay.
just every direction haphazardly. and it's like a dot, like, the size of the stars I'm seeing all around it. And I'm thinking, like, am I just tired? It's 10 at night. I'm like rubbing my eyes. I'm like,
Mhm.
what is that? That doesn't doesn't make any sense. And I saw it again the next night too. And I have no idea what I was seeing. Like, is this like my eyes? Is it my head? But what the heck is
Really?
this thing just moving around with like seemingly no direction, but in a contained area of the sky?
Really?
Yeah, that was weird. That's
Okay.
it.
There it is. It's
Yeah,
unidentified.
it was an unidentified moving dot.
Moving dot. Was it like transparent or clear or defined or
It just
angled or
like just a twinkle like a star. Yeah, just a little
wow.
point of light. Yeah,
See? Okay.
that's it.
Well, there's that. See? Love it. And this, again, this book, friends, family, kids, students, like I said, there's gross pictures of aliens. So, there's that. But there's your documentation is stellar. There's lots of things that you've brought out from the archives and the records that are in here too,
Yeah.
pictures of which. And you have some great graphics, that kind of lay out things, which I love because as you start getting into, let's be honest, some of these stories about the encounters, about the abductions, about what was seen in the narratives and the, recollections, you need a break. You need to take that in and digest, and then you give us a nice visual or a, visual break or a chapter break. And I'm like, whew, okay. And I do like those too. I mean, you really come at it like lighthearted. I know that there's, all kinds of you can go very deep and very into some of these things. Did you attend any of the conferences or did you independently do some of these investigations? Or were you at like the UFO conference or
I
annual
went
meeting?
to yeah, I went to the MUFON conference,
How was that?
and that was the 2022, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was summer 2022. And it was great because I got to first of all, I got to meet a lot of the people I'd spoken to by phone. So I got to meet them in person, which was great. And I got to talk to them a little bit more, got more stories. And of course, I met more people and got more stories. One of my favorites there, I met in a chapter about abductions, I met a woman who was a camerawoman for Baywatch and had lots of abduction
Yes.
experiences. And one of them got made into an episode, which I love. I love, like, believe what you want about her stories,
I love that
but it
one.
made an impact on pop culture in the form of an episode of Baywatch. So I thought
Right,
that was
right.
pretty fun. But and I met another guy who had an experience in Massachusetts, which was pretty interesting, the Berkshires area, which ended up being an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So it was great to meet these people in person and talk to them again firsthand. And then just the various lectures, it was interesting to hear people's perspectives and beliefs. And they had a variety of people from scientists to experiencers and all kinds of different lectures. And it was interesting. It wasn't like people, I think you think of a UFO conference like a Comic-Con or something. It wasn't like people dressed up like aliens. There was none of that. It was pretty normal looking group of people. Uh,
Yeah.
just curious, about again what's going on and want to learn more.
Wow.
So that was fun. It
And
was definitely a worthwhile thing to attend again, just for the research in the book and getting more stories and
yeah,
hearing from people
that's
firsthand.
cool. Oh,
Yeah,
good. I'm glad you got to meet them. I'm glad they got to meet you. I'm glad you put this book together. This is really enjoyable. And I know you've got another book coming that we're going to have to get into next time you're on the show.
yeah.
Mark, you're just crushing it with these great stories and great collections. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. So I encourage everyone, we are not alone. Marc Hartzman, The Extraordinary History of UFOs, Aliens Invading Our Hopes, Fears, and Fantasies. Thank you so much. I know we're going to see you again on the show soon. So until then, we'll all start looking up at the sky a little more intentionally. Thanks,
Thanks so
Mark.
much, Beth.
Cool. What did
If you haven't already geeked out enough, there's much more at casualspacepodcast.com. There's more on the Facebook page, Casual Space Podcast.